The power of silence. Have you ever felt like your mind is constantly buzzing with thoughts, unable to find peace no matter how hard you try? You're not alone. In a world full of distractions, many of us struggle to find the calm we crave. But what if the key to inner peace is not more noise, but less? Here's the surprising truth. Studies have shown that people who embrace silence in their daily lives report feeling more centered, focused, and at peace, regardless of their age or circumstances. And yet, silence remains a rare and precious commodity in today's fast-paced world. In today's video, we're going to explore how silence, something so simple yet so powerful, can transform your life. We'll dive into the Buddhist teachings on silence, revealing how this practice can guide you toward true peace and self-discovery. By the end of this video, you'll understand why silence is more than just a break from noise, it's a pathway to a deeper connection with yourself. Stay with us until the end to discover how you can begin incorporating silence into your life today and unlock its transformative power. In the sacred stillness of the forest, far from the distractions of the bustling world, the Buddhist monk lived his days in quiet contemplation. His wisdom was renowned, not because he sought recognition, but because he had mastered the art of listening, not just to the world, but to the deepest recesses of his own being. The monk had a profound understanding of the human condition, and it was this insight that attracted the troubled king to seek him out. The king, a man of immense wealth and power, sat before the monk, his face etched with frustration. Despite all that he possessed, the king's heart was restless. "I have everything," he said, "and yet, I am empty. The world is filled with noise, and I cannot find peace." The monk, unmoved by the king's outward display of despair, calmly replied, "You are looking for peace in the wrong places. The noise you hear is not from the world, but from within. To find peace, you must first turn inward." These words, simple yet profound, held a truth that the king had never considered. The monk did not offer the king more riches or power, nor did he promise a quick fix. Instead, he invited the king into a space of silence, an invitation to stop the external noise and to confront the turmoil within, the king's journey. And so, the king, driven by his desire for inner peace, agreed to follow the monk's guidance. For the next 15 days, he would live in silence. The monk instructed the king to refrain from speaking, to avoid conversation, and to spend his time in quiet observation. No longer would he be able to fill his day with distractions or seek answers from the world around him. The king's only task was to sit in stillness, to observe, and to listen, to himself, to nature, and to the present moment. On the first day, the king's mind was a storm of thoughts. The silence felt suffocating, his mind racing with questions, doubts, and desires. He longed to speak, to make sense of the turmoil within him. But he resisted. Instead, he sat in the stillness, watching the world unfold around him, birds flying, flowers blooming, and the wind whispering through the trees. The beauty that had always been around him now felt alive, vibrant, and profound. It was as though the world itself had been waiting for him to notice. In this silence, the king began to feel the pull of something deeper, something he had long forgotten. His mind, once cluttered with the noise of his thoughts and the demands of his kingdom, started to quiet. Each day, he found more peace in the stillness, and by the 10th day, the king noticed something remarkable. The restless thoughts that had plagued him for so long no longer held power over him. His mind had calmed, like a turbulent sea that had finally settled into a serene, reflective pool. On the 12th day, the king found himself in a state of deep meditation. His mind, once a battlefield, had transformed into a space of peace and clarity. He realized that true peace did not come from the outside world, but from within. The silence had allowed him to reconnect with his inner self, to discover a part of him that had been hidden beneath the layers of external noise and distractions. The king's awakening. As the 15 days came to a close, the king approached the monk, his face serene, his eyes reflecting a newfound wisdom. "I now understand," the king said, his voice calm but filled with awe. The restlessness in my mind was not caused by the world around me. It was my own words, my constant talking, my endless chatter, that kept my mind in turmoil. I spoke too much, filled my days with unnecessary conversations, and wasted energy thinking negatively about others. I had never realized how much my words were draining me. But in this silence, I have found something I never expected: peace. The monk, with a knowing smile, nodded. Silence, he said, is the gateway to understanding. It is only in silence that we can hear the deepest truths of our own hearts. You have learned that your words, though powerful, can also be the source of your suffering if used recklessly. Silence allows you to hear the voice of wisdom, both within yourself and in the world around you. You have begun to understand that the true strength of a person is not in the words they speak, but in the wisdom they hold in the silence between their words. The monk's words echoed in the serene atmosphere of the forest, his voice calm yet brimming with wisdom. He spoke of Gautama Buddha, a figure whose very life embodied the transformative power of silence. Buddha, he said, was not silent because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that true wisdom is born from stillness. The monk paused, letting the weight of the words settle. When asked why he chose silence so often, the Buddha responded, "I stay silent to dive deep within myself." Silence is the first step to truly knowing oneself. Without silence, self-discovery is impossible. The king, intrigued, listened intently. It was hard for him to imagine that a man who had given such profound teachings had done so much of it in silence. The monk continued, his gaze distant, as though he were tapping into the very essence of those ancient words. In a world that is filled with noise, both external and internal, silence becomes a rare and invaluable treasure. Most people speak excessively, believing that words are the key to connection. Yet, the more we talk, the more we scatter our energy, dilute our focus, and lose touch with the inner peace that lies deep within us. It was then that the monk began to speak of a deeper truth, one that extended beyond religious doctrine. Silence, he said, is not merely the absence of sound. It is the presence of clarity. It is the space in which our minds can breathe, where the restless waves of thought can calm and settle, allowing us to connect with the quiet wisdom that resides in every person. Silence is where the real conversation with our soul takes place. The monk's words reminded the king of something he had often heard but never fully understood: how silence is not a void, but a fertile ground for reflection and introspection. He remembered the ancient teachings of the Taoist sages, who emphasized the importance of stillness for the cultivation of wisdom. Laozi, the legendary figure behind the Tao Te Ching, spoke of the Tao, or the Way, as something that could only be perceived through silence and surrender to the natural flow of the universe. Laozi wrote, "Those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know." The power of silence, in Taoist philosophy, lies in its ability to connect one to the eternal and unspoken truths of existence. The monk's reflection then shifted to another example, one from a much earlier time in history. He spoke of Socrates, the renowned Greek philosopher, who, despite his famous dialogues, understood the potency of silence. Socrates often said that true wisdom comes from acknowledging one's ignorance, and he believed that silence allowed one to listen deeply, to engage in a form of mental stillness that made space for insight. His method of questioning, the Socratic method, encouraged his disciples not just to answer questions, but to pause and reflect before speaking, so they might discover the truth within themselves. Silence, the monk emphasized, has always been the vehicle for profound understanding. It's not about retreating from the world, but about engaging with it on a deeper level. Silence allows us to disconnect from the chaos of our environment and reconnect with the inner stillness where clarity resides. It's in this silence that we shed the layers of pretense, the distractions of ego, and the illusions that keep us from seeing life as it truly is. The monk's voice softened, and he shared one final thought, rooted in the Buddhist tradition. In meditation, we embrace silence not as a means of escape, but as a means of insight. Buddha, in his own silent meditations, transcended the illusion of duality and reached enlightenment. It was through silence that he saw beyond the surface of the world, recognizing the interconnectedness of all things. In that stillness, he found peace not just for himself, but for all beings. When we embrace silence, we too can experience that same interconnectedness, our minds and hearts attuned to the rhythm of the universe. The king, deeply moved, sat in silence, reflecting on the monk's words. The realization was profound, in a world of constant chatter. Silence was not a luxury, but a necessity. It was the fertile ground where wisdom grew, where clarity emerged, and where one could truly find peace. This story is more than just a lesson in the power of silence. It is a timeless reflection on the human condition. In today's world, we often find ourselves consumed by the noise of modern life, endless social media updates, constant chatter in our conversations, and the never-ending need to be heard. But the truth is, in this noise, we lose touch with the very essence of who we are. In ancient cultures across the world, silence was not seen as an absence, but as a presence, a space for reflection, growth, and self-realization. In the teachings of many great spiritual leaders, silence was considered a powerful tool for self-discovery. The Buddha himself often retreated into silence, not as a form of avoidance, but as a means of deepening his understanding of life. It is said that Buddha's most profound realizations came during periods of intense silence and meditation, when he allowed his mind to settle and his heart to listen. History is filled with examples of the transformative power of silence. Consider the great philosopher Socrates, whose teachings are renowned for their emphasis on asking questions and listening deeply. Socrates believed that wisdom could only be attained through reflection and dialogue, but he also recognized the importance of silence as a space for contemplating the deeper truths of life. His famous dictum, "Know thyself," speaks to the profound understanding that comes from within, an understanding that can only be accessed through silence and self-awareness. In our own lives, we often forget that silence is not an absence of life, but a means of connecting more deeply with it. Just as the king discovered, it is in the quiet moments of reflection that we find clarity. In a world filled with noise, silence becomes a refuge, a space to reconnect with our true selves and rediscover the peace that lies within us all. The lesson here is simple, yet powerful. When we learn to embrace silence, we not only discover the peace within, but we also become more attuned to the world around us. We begin to see the beauty in the small moments, to hear the wisdom in the silence, and to recognize the power of our own words when we choose them wisely. So, as you go through your own journey, take a moment each day to embrace silence. Let it become a space where you can reconnect with your inner peace, where you can listen to the whispers of wisdom, and where you can find the strength to move through life with clarity and purpose. In silence, you will discover that the answers you seek have always been inside you, waiting to be heard. In my own journey, I've discovered a profound truth that silence isn't merely the absence of noise, but the presence of something far greater. It is the gateway to the depths of self-understanding. As I carved out time each day to sit in silence, a quiet revelation began to unfold within me. I began to hear the subtle hum of my inner world, the thoughts, the emotions, the yearnings that had always been there but were drowned out by the constant chatter of life. Silence, I realized, was not just about stopping the noise from the outside world, but about quieting the endless dialogue within. It's as if the moment I ceased to speak, I could hear the language of my soul, a language composed not of words, but of deep insights that led me to the heart of who I truly am. This introspective quiet wasn't about isolating myself or retreating from life, but about listening to the very rhythms of existence that I had long neglected. I began to understand, much like the great philosophers and sages before me, that silence is the fertile soil in which wisdom takes root. Just as the mighty oak tree lies hidden in the seed, waiting for the stillness of the earth to nourish it, so too does the wisdom of life lie within us, waiting for the silence to allow it to emerge. It's in those moments of stillness that I have discovered solutions to dilemmas that once seemed insurmountable, insights into relationships that were clouded by my own bias, and answers to life's greatest questions that I had been too hurried to hear. The renowned philosopher Laozi, in his Tao Te Ching, suggested that silence is a source of great strength. I have come to embody this truth. In the quiet, I have experienced a strength of a different kind, not a forceful, external strength, but a subtle, internal power that allows me to face life's challenges with an unwavering sense of calm. It is a strength that does not seek to dominate or control, but to remain rooted in inner peace, no matter how turbulent the external world may become. In those precious moments of silence, I have found a clarity that eludes me in the busyness of everyday life. It is as if the noise and distractions of the world are like the dust clouding a mirror. Only when I sit in silence does the dust settle, and I can see clearly. And in that clarity, I've discovered that true happiness is not a destination that can be reached through achievement or external validation, but an inner state that is always present, waiting to be acknowledged. I am reminded of the wisdom of the ancient Zen masters, who emphasized the importance of being with oneself. They spoke of a deep, transformative silence that allows us to experience the fullness of life in each moment. The Japanese Zen poet Ikkyu, known for his sharp insights, once wrote, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." Through silence, I've learned to embrace my wounds, my vulnerabilities. And in doing so, I have allowed the light of wisdom to penetrate, healing what was once broken. It's in this quietude, this simple act of being, that I have come to understand that true peace does not lie in the external world but within. It's always been there, buried beneath the layers of our busy minds, waiting for us to give it the space to emerge. As the Buddha taught, peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. And so, I invite you to create this space for yourself, 20 minutes each day, free from the noise and distractions of life, to simply be. Close your eyes, sit in stillness, and allow the flow of your thoughts to settle. Let the busyness of your mind calm like a still pond after a storm. In that space, you will find a peace that is untouched by the world, a peace that is yours and yours alone. The wisdom, the clarity, and the happiness you seek are not somewhere out there, they are here, inside you, waiting for you to listen. Imagine waking up every day with a mind that is calm, clear, and focused, free from the noise and chaos of the world. Silence isn't just the absence of sound, it's the presence of true peace, wisdom, and self-awareness. Now is the time to take control of your inner peace. Start by carving out moments of silence each day. Let go of unnecessary distractions and listen to the quiet whispers of your heart. Even if it's just for a few minutes, begin your journey of stillness today. We are creating a community of seekers who are ready to embrace the transformative power of silence and mindfulness. Join us by subscribing, and share your thoughts or your own experiences with silence in the comments below. Let's support each other on this path to inner peace and wisdom. Your peace begins with you. Embrace the silence, and let it guide you to a life of clarity and fulfillment.